Thank you all for coming out to hear me speak tonight. It's a great privilege to be here at Reed, and I've had a very interesting day, and I look forward to the Q&A session after I talk tonight. The subject, as Alex said, is can China rise peacefully? And what I want to do is start with two preliminary comments and then go into the heart and soul of my talk. My first preliminary comment is that I think there are two big questions surrounding the rise of China. The first is, will China continue to rise over the next 30 or 40 years the way it has risen over the past 30 years? In other words, is it likely that China will continue its impressive rise? And then the second question is, if China does rise, if it continues to rise, can it rise peacefully? With regard to the first question, which is of great importance, I am agnostic. I have no idea what the answer is to that question. I've talked to all sorts of people, and to my amazement, there are very smart people on both sides of that debate. I'm always amazed when I go to China and I talk to scholars and policymakers who think that China is not going to continue to rise in an impressive way. They believe that China has structural problems that make that extremely unlikely. There are other people who argue exactly the opposite. I'm agnostic. All I'm doing here is assuming that China is going to continue to rise. And then I'm going to the second question, which I think will be the most important question of the 21st century, should China continue to rise. I think this is an enormously important question, especially for the United States, but for China's neighbors and for China itself. So that's the question. Second preliminary point. The only way you can answer the question is with a theory. And the reason that you can only answer it with a theory is because we have no facts about the future. Right? There's just no facts. The future hasn't happened yet. This is an exercise in prediction. So when I go to Washington, I sometimes run into people who will say, I was in Beijing last week, I talked to persons X, Y, and Z, and after talking to those three people, I'm convinced that China can rise peacefully. I say, this is a bunch of hooey. Persons X, Y, and Z will probably be 6 feet under by the time this question's operative. And furthermore, the people who will be running China are probably in high school now. And how do you know what they're going to be thinking in 20 years or 30 years? You just can't know. We have no facts about the future because it hasn't happened yet. Therefore, what we need is a theory. We need a theory about great power politics. We need a theory about rising great powers that we are confident can explain the past and the present, and therefore will be good at explaining the future. So this says that what I have to do tonight is I have to lay out my theory of great power politics. That's the first thing that I have to do. Then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a synoptic version of American foreign policy since 1783. And what I'm going to try and do in giving you that synoptic version of American foreign policy is convince you that it coincides with my theory, that my theory fits neatly with American foreign policy since 1783. And that's all designed to give you confidence that my theory makes good sense and it has some predictive power. Then the third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the theory and I'm going to apply it to China. And not only am I going to apply it to China, I'm going to ask what the United States and what China's neighbors are likely to do in addition to what China is likely to do. So again, there are 3 parts to my lecture. First, you're going to get my theory of great power politics. Second part is I'm going to take that theory and apply it to American foreign policy from 1783 up to the present. Third part is I'm going to take the theory and apply it to the rise of China, talk about China and what it's going to do. And of course, my argument will be, you're all smart enough to figure this out, that China will imitate the United States, and the United States acts according to the theory, therefore China acts according to the theory. Right, so that's the exercise. So let me start with my theory. My theory begins with 5 simple assumptions about the world. And I take those 5 assumptions and I put them in the blender and I hit the on switch, mix them up, and get 3 forms of behavior. And what those 3 forms of behavior tell you is that we live in a very competitive world where great powers compete with each other to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. Okay? So let me start with the 5 assumptions and then tell you how I reached that conclusion. First assumption is that states are the principal actors in the international system, and that system is anarchic. That means that there's no higher authority that sits above states. Anarchy is the opposite of hierarchy. Most of you probably think anarchy means murder and mayhem. That's not what anarchy means in my story. Anarchy in my story is simply the opposite of hierarchy. It says that there's no higher authority that sits above states. States are the principal actors in the system, and they're like pool balls on a table. Second assumption is all states have some offensive military capability. Obviously, a country like Belgium, a country like Mozambique, a country like Guatemala has very little offensive military capability. And in contrast, countries like the United States, countries like Israel, countries like Britain, countries like Russia have considerable offensive military capability. But the point is, every country has some offensive military capability. Third assumption, which is of great importance, has to do with intentions. Remember, the first assumption was that states are the principal actors and they operate in an anarchic system, no hierarchy. Second was all states have some offensive military capability. Third assumption has to do with intentions. And there the assumption is you can never be certain about the intentions of other states. Now, this is an enormously important assumption in my theory, and that's why I want to spend a couple minutes unpacking it, this assumption about intentions. The reason that intentions are so difficult to divine is because they're in the heads of policymakers and you can't see them. They're very different than capabilities. During the Cold War, when we used to look at the Soviet Union, we used to be trying to figure out, number one, what were Soviet capabilities, and 2, what were Soviet intentions. Capabilities were never hard to figure out. We could see these material capabilities. We could count how many attack submarines, how many SS-18s, how many Foxbats, how many armored division equivalents the Soviets had. We had a really good sense of what their capabilities were. We could never figure out what their intentions were. We had huge debates as to what was inside Nikita Khrushchev's head or what was inside Leonid Brezhnev's head. Some people said X, some people said Y, others said Z. You just couldn't know because you can't see them. So intentions are very hard to divine. Now, some people would disagree with me on that. Say you can get a pretty good sense of what intentions are today. My Sunday punch in response is, even if you think you could figure out what intentions are today, there's no way you can know what future intentions are. There's no way you can know what future leaders of any country will be thinking. And a good example that illustrates this has nothing to do with IR, has to do with divorce. Think about divorce. When 2 people get married, they invariably think that the person they're marrying is wonderful. I mean, who would get married to someone you didn't think was wonderful? You think that person has benign intentions towards you, right? Well, you know we have a 50% divorce rate in America. That means that 50% of the people are guessing wrong, right? That means that they think they're marrying a person who's going to think they're the cat's meow, as my mother would say, forever and ever. And that proves not to be the case. This is actually a very depressing thought. But if you think about it, you can never be certain that the person you're marrying won't turn out to be Attila the Hun. Now, I want to be clear. This is not to say you can be certain that the person will turn out to be Attila the Hun. Because after all, 50% of the people do live happily ever after. It's just to say you can't be certain that that person won't turn out to be Attila the Hun. And the same thing is true with regard to the intentions of states. You cannot know, I believe, what the intentions of states are now, but you certainly can't know over the long term. Okay? So 3 assumptions on the table. The system is anarchic. Got states in this system as the principal actors, and it's an anarchic system. They all have some offensive capability. And number 3, you can't be certain about intentions. 4th assumption, which will be commonsensical to all of you folks, is that the principal goal of states is to survive. And this is not to say that survival is the only goal. It's to say it's the most important goal. And it's the most important goal for the obvious reason that if you don't survive, you can't pursue the other goals. 5th assumption is states are rational actors. States are strategic calculators. This is a way of basically saying that states are good at figuring out clever strategies for maximizing their prospects of survival. It's the rational actor assumption. Those are the 5 assumptions. You take them in the blender, put them in the blender, you hit the on switch, you mix them up. You get 3 forms of behavior. First is states fear each other. They fear each other because there's always the danger you'll end up living next to a state that has significant offensive military capability and malign intentions towards you. Because you can't be certain about intentions, and some states have a lot of offensive capability. You end up living next door to Adolf Hitler. You end up living next door to Imperial Japan. It is not going to be pretty, right? So that's the first reason you fear other states. The second reason is, in the international system, when you dial 911, you know who's at the other end? Nobody, because it's an anarchic system. There's no 911. So you fear other states. Obviously, that level of fear varies from case to case, but fear is always there. The 911 problem points to the second form of behavior. States quickly figure out that the best way to survive in this system is to depend on themselves. The international system, as we say in political science speak, is a self-help system. Or as my mother used to say when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. That's how the state system works. Why? Because you can never trust that somebody will be there for you. If you're a Ukrainian, are you going to trust the Americans? Please, you don't trust the Russians? You don't trust anybody. Do it for yourself. Provide for your own security. It's a self-help system. So the first form of behavior is fear. Second is self-help. Third is that states in this system quickly figure out that the best way to survive is, to use rhetoric I've already used, that we used in New York City when I was a little boy, is to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. Because if you're the biggest and baddest dude on the block, nobody fools around with you. How many of you people go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico attacking us? Have you ever thought about that? You worry about Canada or Mexico attacking us? Or maybe you worry about Guatemala or the Dominican Republic? Come on. It's inconceivable that any state in this region would attack us. Why? Because we are incredibly powerful. In an anarchic system where you cannot be certain about the intentions of other states, you want to be extremely powerful because it's the best way to survive. You want to maximize your relative power. You want to be the hegemon. Now, I want to unpack this a bit more. I believe that no state can become a global hegemon simply because the globe is too big and there's too much water. I believe that the best you can do is be a hegemon in your region of the world. You dominate your region of the world. And this, of course, is what the United States does. The United States is the only regional hegemon in modern history. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. But the goal is to be a regional hegemon, to be so powerful that you don't have to go to bed at night worrying about anybody in your neighborhood attacking you. But you have a second goal. The second goal is to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon in the world. To put it in Pentagonese, you want to make sure you don't have a peer competitor. You want to make sure that Imperial Germany does not dominate all of Europe. You want to make sure you, the United States, dominate the Western Hemisphere, but nobody dominates their region of the world the way you dominate yours. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, I can understand, given what John has said about anarchy and uncertainty about intentions, why you want to be a hegemon in your region. But why does it matter if you have a hegemon in another region? It all has to do with the concept I call freedom to roam. Most of you have never thought about this, I'm sure. One of the reasons that the United States is running all over God's little green acre, sticking its nose in everybody's business, is not simply because we're powerful, but because we're free to roam. We have no security threats in the Western Hemisphere. And because we have no security threats in the Western Hemisphere, we don't have to commit any forces, we don't have to commit resources to this region. We're free to roam. And we roam all over the place. Just think about you're in China. You're looking out along your coastline. You see the U.S. Navy out there. You see the U.S. Air Force out there. You see Army troops in Korea. You see ground troops, Marines in particular, in Okinawa. You go to Europe. The Americans are in Europe. The Americans are in the Gulf. The Americans are here, there, and everywhere. Why? Because we're free to roam. Well, if you're the United States of America, you don't want anybody else to be free to roam. Why? Because they'll roam into your backyard. Right? So what my theory says is that if you're a great power, you have two goals. One, to be a regional hegemon, and two, make sure you have no peer competitor. There's no other regional hegemon. That's my theory. And it's based on those 5 assumptions. Second part of my talk, American foreign policy from 1783 to the present. When the United States got started, after we won our independence from Britain in 1783, we were comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the eastern seaboard. Over the next 60-plus years, we marched across North America, murdered huge numbers of Native Americans, stole their land, went to war with Mexico in the 1840s, stole from them what is now the southwest of the United States. In 1812, we invaded Canada with the express purpose of making Canada part of the United States. The reason that Toronto is not the capital of Canada and Ottawa is the British, who ran that place at the time, expected us to pay a return visit, and they didn't want the capital close to the American border. They wanted it further back. That's why Ottawa is the capital. We had a voracious appetite for conquest. We wanted the Caribbean very badly. The southern states were desperate to move south, and the only reason we didn't move south, the only reason the Caribbean is not part of the United States today is because of the slavery issue. As many of you know, sugar was the principal crop in the Caribbean. Sugar is even more labor-intensive than cotton and tobacco. That meant there were even more slaves in the Caribbean than there were in the American South, and the northern states did not want any more slave-holding states in the Union. That's what held us up from going south. Right? We had a voracious appetite for conquest and annexation. It's no accident that when Adolf Hitler went into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, for the next few months, he talked frequently about imitating what the Americans did. He said, these are a people who know how to create Lebensraum. He referred to the Volga River as our Mississippi. For purposes of creating regional hegemony, we not only had to conquer all of that territory in North America, that was called Manifest Destiny, we also had another task, and that was to throw the European great powers out of the hemisphere and keep them out. You all know that in 1823, old President James Monroe basically told the European great powers, we're not strong enough to throw you out now. We're eventually going to throw you out, and we're not going to let you back in. This is our hemisphere, and you are not welcome here. That's what the Monroe Doctrine was all about. It wasn't until 1898 that we finally finished off the Spanish and the Spanish-American War, and we clearly established hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The British were gone, the French were gone. There were no European great powers left. And there are enough people in this audience who are old enough to remember during the Cold War when the Soviet Union used to monkey around in Cuba. You remember how that used to drive us stark raving crazy? Who are these people to come in our hemisphere? We own the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. So the Manifest Destiny policy and the Monroe Doctrine policy, that was the essence of establishing regional hegemony. Now, as I told you, great powers have two goals. One is to establish regional hegemony, and two is to make sure you don't have a peer competitor. In the 20th century, after we established regional hegemony, we had four potential peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. In the spring of 1917, when it looked like Germany might win World War I, we intervened, and I would make the argument, if I had 3 more hours, that we tipped the balance in favor of the Allies and helped defeat Imperial Germany. We were not going to let them dominate Europe. In World War II, we beat the Japanese single-handedly in the Pacific. We had no intention of letting Japan dominate East Asia. And with regard to Nazi Germany, we played a key role. The Soviets, of course, played the key role, but excuse me, the United States played a key role defeating Nazi Germany in World War II. And then during the Cold War, we played the principal role containing the Soviet Union, and then when it collapsed, we ushered it down the toilet bowl. And shortly thereafter, the George H.W. Bush administration made it clear that we were number one, and we had every intention of remaining number one. So what I'm trying to say to you here is, if you look at American history in a cold and calculating way, it's quite clear that the United States has behaved according to the dictates of my theory. Third part of my talk, I want to talk about China. Again, we're assuming that China continues to grow economically. You don't think China is going to try to dominate Asia? You know, the Chinese refer to the period roughly between 1850 and 1950 as the century of national humiliation. China was very weak. You know what happens when you're very weak in the international system? Other states take advantage of you. The Japanese, the Americans with their open door policy, the Europeans, they all took advantage of the Chinese. They did terrible things to the Chinese. The Chinese remember it. This is why Chinese nationalism is such a dangerous force today. That century of national humiliation gnaws at them. Well, getting back to the realist story, the balance of power story, you don't think the Chinese are going to care greatly about being so powerful in Asia that nobody can fool around with them again? I bet they are. I bet they're really going to care. You go up to your average Chinese policymaker and you say, you have two choices. Choice number one, China can be 20 times more powerful than Japan. Choice number two, Japan is 20 times more powerful than China. Do you think it matters? What do you think the Chinese policymaker is going to say? He's going to say, we'll take that first option every time. We want to be much more powerful than Japan. We remember what happened the last time we were weak. What about the Americans in East Asia? You think the Chinese are happy about having the Americans running aircraft and ships up and down their coastline? You think that makes them happy? It doesn't. We have a Monroe Doctrine. You don't think they're going to have a Monroe Doctrine? They're already talking, the Chinese, about pushing us out beyond the first island chain, and then when they get powerful enough, pushing us out beyond the second island chain. It's Monroe Doctrine mentality. I don't blame them one bit. If I was the national security advisor in Beijing and the president asked me what we should do with the Americans, I'd say we should figure out how to get them out of here. The same way as if I was in Washington, I'd be a staunch proponent of the Monroe Doctrine. I don't want the Chinese, Germany, Soviet Union, Japan, I don't want anybody monkeying around in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Because the best way to be secure in an anarchic world where you can't be certain about the intentions of other states is to be a regional hegemon. So why shouldn't the Chinese have their own Monroe Doctrine? Why shouldn't they try to push the Americans out? As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Well, if it's good for us to have a Monroe Doctrine, please explain to me why it's not good for them to have a Monroe Doctrine. They're going to have one, believe me. They're going to try and dominate Asia, and they're not going to want us in their backyard. And that gets to another issue. If they do dominate Asia, and this is going to be a very powerful country if they grow economically, right? If they dominate Asia, they will be free to roam. And they will roam into the Western Hemisphere. And this will not make us happy. See? So that's why we, and this brings us to the Americans, this is why the Americans will go to great lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. Okay? So I'm telling you that what Chinese will do, if they continue to grow economically, is they'll translate that economic might into military might, and they'll try to dominate Asia. And what the Americans will do is the Americans will try to contain them and ultimately wreck them. That's what we did with Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. You think we're going to let them dominate Asia? Think we're going to stand by and let that happen? You've all heard of the pivot to Asia. What do you think the pivot to Asia is all about? We're pivoting to Asia for a very good reason. We're scared of the Chinese. And by the way, we're not the only country that's scared of the Chinese. Virtually all of China's neighbors, except for North Korea and Pakistan, are scared of China. You can see the balancing coalition already beginning to form. For those of you who have doubts, go home and Google Japan and India strategic cooperation. Japan, India strategic cooperation. Google it. You'll be amazed at how many articles come up. Japanese and the Indians are talking. The Americans and the Vietnamese are talking. Vietnamese have been talking. It's about coming back to Cam Ranh Bay. Philippines. When the Cold War ended, the Philippines said adios to the Americans. Don't come back. They're singing a completely different tune now. Go to Singapore. Very different world. They're all nervous. Can you blame them? They are living next door to a very big and very powerful country. The balancing coalition will be South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, of course the United States, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Russia, be the balancing coalition. Myanmar. For those of you who have doubts, just watch the newspapers over the next 2 years and watch us working on Myanmar. What we're trying to do with Myanmar now is peel them away from the Chinese. Right? The Chinese and the Burmese have been quite friendly for a long time, and we're trying to peel away Myanmar. So what I'm telling you is that as China continues to rise, what's going to happen is you're going to have an intense security competition. The Chinese on one side and the Americans and their Asian allies on the other side. Now, what's going to make this an especially intense competition is what we call in international relations the security dilemma. The security dilemma basically says that anything that one country does for defensive purposes appears offensive in nature to the other country, and vice versa. Let me give you an example. The pivot to Asia. If you were to ask Barack Obama, is this offensive or defensive in nature? He would say, of course, behind closed doors, because we're not allowed to talk publicly in an honest way about what we're doing here in America, right? He would tell you, again, behind closed doors, that we're pivoting to Asia for purposes of containing China, and it's being done for defensive reasons. And I believe that he genuinely believes it, and I believe that from an American perspective, it's correct. But if you're sitting in Beijing and you see the Americans pivoting to Asia, it does not look defensive in nature to you. It looks offensive in nature to you. And the Americans say, well, it's just containment. The Chinese say, it doesn't look like containment to us. When I listen to John Mearsheimer talk, it sounds like encirclement. Before World War I, the French, the Russians, and the British put together the Triple Entente. The Triple Entente was designed to contain, to deter Imperial Germany. If you were sitting in Berlin in those days, what you would say is, these countries are not containing us, they are encircling us. Moscow used to say the same thing during the Cold War. Just to switch gears a bit, let's go to Beijing. Beijing sees what's going on, sees that its neighbors are increasingly distrustful. The Japanese are spending more money on defense. The Americans are pivoting to Asia. So the Chinese say what we have to do is spend more money on defense to defend ourselves. Well, what does the Pentagon interpret this as? They're building offensive military capability. This is evidence that they have aggressive intentions. Remember, I told you, you can't tell what intentions are. Intentions are very hard to read, but you can see capabilities. So what happens is the Chinese see American capabilities increasing, the Americans see Chinese capabilities increasing, and because they can't really figure out what intentions are, they use capabilities as a proxy. Right? This is the essence of the security dilemma. And the end result is that both sides are going to spend a lot more money on defense, and each side is going to interpret the other side to be doing it for offensive purposes while they're doing it for defensive purposes. This is the security dilemma. So what that is going to do is it's going to fuel the arms race. It's going to fuel that competition. And it's going to make the likelihood of war reasonably high. Not very high. We do live in a nuclear world, but reasonably high. It will be very dangerous, like the Cold War. Let me conclude by returning to the subject of theory. As some of you know, our theories in the social sciences are crude instruments. Our theories are not very good. We have no choice but to employ theory to make sense of the world. We just need theory. But nevertheless, our social science theories are not very good. I often tell students, if your theory gets it right 75% of the time, you're in the Hall of Fame. So you come up with a theory, you get it right 75% of the time, you're in the Hall of Fame. Let's assume that my theory is right 75% of the time, and I'm in the Hall of Fame. This makes me feel good, of course. It may not be true, but let's just assume that. That means, however, that my theory is wrong 25% of the time. In other words, there are cases that come up where my theory can't explain it, and that happens 25% of the time. Given the bleak story that I've told you here tonight, let's hope that the rise of China falls in the category of those 25% of cases where my theory fails. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. Is there a mic? Oh, there's a microphone right there. Why don't we start with this gentleman here?
Do I need the mic?
Yes.
Does it work? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You know, I am a little bit disturbed because you haven't answered the question that this evening was intended to answer. Can China rise peacefully? It seems to me that one of the problems is that it's the wrong question. The real question is, will this country, the United States, allow China to rise peacefully? Because the way you've described our situation to maintain the regional hegemony, it means that it's basically our relatively aggressive moves against China to contain it, rather than any aggressive moves by China which says we have core interests that we will defend, but they are not hegemony. So, again, I think that the question should be reversed. Will this country allow China to rise peacefully?
Well, from China's point of view, the best way to achieve hegemony is to do it peacefully. Right? There's no question about that. The Chinese have been involved in a number of crises in recent years. And my view is that other countries precipitated all of those crises, that the Chinese have precipitated remarkably few crises. I think the Chinese have overreacted when other countries have precipitated the crises, but nevertheless, the Chinese have not precipitated the crises. And the reason is time is on China's side, right? China just gets more and more powerful with time. So if you're China, you don't want to start a fight now over some islands in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. If you're the Philippines or you're Vietnam or you're Japan and time is not on your side, you want to start the trouble now when Uncle Sam is really much more powerful than China is. So the Chinese have a vested interest in rising peacefully. And by the way, given that they will have roughly 4 times the population of the United States in the year 2050, if they turn into a giant Hong Kong or a giant South Korea, this is going to be a superpower like we've never seen before, right? Oh my God. I mean, I'm just sort of embellishing your point that, they may rise peacefully. And they have a vested interest in doing it peacefully. We will not let them, right? The United States, as I tried to make clear, is a ruthless great power. You want to remember, this is a slightly different subject. It doesn't have to do with containing China. The Cold War ended in 1989. That was 25 years ago. We have been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended, and we have fought 6 different wars. And we're itching to fight wars in places like Syria and Iran, right? So the United States is a tough customer. Just one other story on this. When I go to China, I've given this talk in China many times. Chinese are very realist. When I go to China, I often start my talks by saying, it's good to be back among my people, because I'm a realist, and the Chinese are realists. It's unlike going to Washington. When I go to Washington, it's like an alien culture. I don't know, Alex has been in Washington for the past 2 years. I don't know how you can stand it, right? Just, he's in the Pentagon. I don't know about that either. But the Chinese talk my language. And I don't mean Chinese. I mean realism. But the Chinese do not like what I have. They basically don't like the story I have to tell because they want to think that they can rise and live happily ever after, which is completely understandable. However, there's one part of my story that they love, and that's when I say that the United States is an incredibly ruthless great power. The Chinese response is, finally an American who tells the truth, right? So they like what you just had to say, and I basically agree with you. Sir? You should just hang on just for 1 second. Thank you.
How does the tremendous economic interdependence between America and China complicate things? I think, aren't they our largest trading partner, and aren't they the largest financier of our government? I mean, how can we fight with somebody like that?
Yeah. I've given this talk probably 100 times, and when it comes to counter-arguments, that is always the number one counter-argument to me. It's really quite interesting. And just to embellish it a bit, the argument is, it's what we call in the IR world economic interdependence theory. And his argument is that the United States and China are both hooked on capitalism. They're both getting rich, and they're both trading extensively with each other. Their economy is dependent on ours. Our economy is dependent on theirs. And we could throw the Japanese in, the Australians, and we could tell an even bigger story to support your thesis. And the argument is that going to war would be sheer lunacy because you'd be killing the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? So who's going to start a war? Now, my response is that I would be foolish to say that there would never be any cases that don't conform to your theory. Right? I think there are going to be some cases that conform to your theory, that your theory has some explanatory power. But my argument is your theory has truly limited explanatory power and is not a sound basis for peace. Now, the question is, why does John say that? To a large extent, it has a lot to do with how you think about the relationship between politics and economics. And your argument is basically privileging economics over politics. You're basically saying that in a political crisis or in a crisis over political issues, right, economic considerations will trump political considerations, right? I actually don't believe that. I believe that politics trumps economics in most cases. Again, not all cases, because I concede that there will be cases that fit your theory. But in most cases, politics trumps economics. Now, some of you are probably saying, what exactly is he talking about? Let me give you two examples, both involving China. The best one is Taiwan. The Chinese say that if Taiwan declares its independence, they will go to war like that. So in other words, if next week Taiwan were to declare its independence, China goes to war against Taiwan. It's just not happening. The Chinese fully admit that this would have significant negative economic consequences along the lines you're talking about. But their view is that from a political point of view, Taiwan becoming independent is so thoroughly unacceptable that they would fight and they would pay that economic cost. Right? Another example is the the East China Sea. You know, the Japanese and Chinese are barking at each other over these rocks. Japanese call them the Senkaku Islands. The Chinese call them the Diao Islands, right? And I was in Beijing in November talking to a lot of academics, and they're very worried that war could break out at any point over the Senkaku Diao Islands. They're not saying it's likely. They're just worried. And the argument that people make is that nationalism is a very powerful force in China. It's a very powerful force in Japan. Nationalism means these rocks really matter to both sides. And you could get into a fight. And what they're saying is that politics trumps economics. Right? I'll give you one more example, Ukraine. A lot of people think we should put sanctions on Ukraine, right? Excuse me, sanctions on Russia. We should make Russia pay a significant economic cost for what it did, especially with regard to Crimea. The argument I make is, first of all, we don't have that kind of leverage, but let's assume we did have the leverage. Let's assume we could really make the Russians hurt with economic sanctions. They'd bear the cost. They'd bear the cost because the strategic calculations, the strategic considerations that are involved in this situation are such that they cannot afford, the Russians cannot afford to allow Ukraine to drift into the West's orbit, right? So political considerations, I believe, would dominate economic considerations in that case. I think Putin and company would just swallow the cost, the economic cost. Then my final example is World War I, which is the classic counterexample to your position. There was a huge amount of economic interdependence in Europe before World War I, and you still have World War I. So I think that economic interdependence will not save the day. But again, I may be wrong. Let me come to this woman right here.
Hi. I'm just a little curious, where in this sort of nice system of independent states rationally acting, where would separatist organization or terrorist organizations sort of fit in, or states that act arguably not rationally sort of fit in with the rise of China or the hegemony of the United States?
Okay. There's sort of two questions there. Where do terrorists fit into my story? And number two, where do states that are not rational fit into my story? Just with regard to terrorists, terrorists don't fit into my story. Right? 2 points there. First of all, it's a theory that focuses on states, not terrorists. Secondly, I think terrorism is a pimple on the hiney of humanity, right? It's a minor problem. I know most of you Americans have been brainwashed over the past 15 years to believe that there's this great terrorist threat out there and that, you know, they're going to get us tomorrow and they'll probably use a nuclear weapon. This is just a bunch of hooey, right? The terrorist threat is not a significant threat, and terrorist organizations are not that big a problem. Al-Qaeda got a lucky shot in on September 11th. It was truly regrettable, but the idea that we're sort of under siege and that these people are going to get us again next week or 5 years down the road is just not going to happen, and they're not going to get nuclear weapons either. So the theory doesn't have anything to say about terrorist groups, and it doesn't matter because terrorist groups don't matter. States are the principal actors in the system. With regard to rational actor calculation, it's very interesting. My theory is based on 5 assumptions. The 5th assumption, as I made clear, is that states are rational actors. Obviously, some states are not rational actors some of the time. This gentleman is absolutely correct. That's why my theory is wrong at least 25% of the time. I wish that weren't true. As Alex knows, we all like to have theories that are right 100% of the time, but it's just not the way social science works. And you're pointing to a very important problem, the fact that states don't always act rationally, and therefore the theory doesn't always apply. Why don't we come to this woman right here, and then... You should just wait 2 seconds for the microphone, just so everybody can hear your question.
Do you really believe China economically is that such a big play? I mean, it's a big player, but is it so strong that, as people describe it, or just, you know, the media and the politicians drip up the numbers or whatever, so they can, you know, keep the defense budget or even increase it? Because, I mean, to me, China economically is, I don't believe the number 2 numbers.
Okay. Well, gets back to my first preliminary point. I don't know what to believe, in all honesty. I don't know whether China is going to continue to grow and is growing today much like it did 10 or 15 years ago. It's just very hard for me to say. And when I talk to experts who study the issue, they're all over the map. So it's just hard for me to say. My second and more important point is, I hope the Chinese economy does not grow. I hope the Chinese economy flatlines. You understand, that's the implication of my analysis. I gave a talk in Taiwan in December, and I was talking about Taiwan's future. Taiwan's future is very bleak if China continues to grow, because Taiwan is a small island very close to the Chinese mainland, and the Chinese have made it clear they are eventually going to take Taiwan back. So this is bad news for Taiwan. And what I pointed out was that Taiwanese businessmen in the 1990s and throughout the 2000s were ecstatic about the fact that China was growing economically because they saw it as a wonderful business opportunity. My view at the time, and of course my view now, is this is crazy. If you're Taiwanese, the last thing you want is for the Chinese economy to grow and grow and grow, because you're going to disappear as a de facto independent state, right? And you know, this gets back to this gentleman's question about economic interdependence. See, a lot of people believe that as China grows and grows and grows, it'll never start a war against Taiwan, against anybody, for these kinds of reasons. You follow the argument? Right, this is sort of the counter to me. John, if China continues to grow economically, right, because of economic interdependence theory, you'll have no war. My response to that, and this gets back to your question and marries it to this one, is we cannot be certain about what China's intentions will be. So you're basically telling me that what we're going to do, this is what I say to people who argue against me, you're telling me that what we're going to do is we're going to help China turn into a behemoth when we can't know what its intentions are. This is crazy. No state in its right mind would do it if it was rational, right? You wouldn't do this. We want China to be weak. You want all the other countries in the system to be weak, and you want to be Godzilla, simply because that's the best way to survive in an anarchic system where you can't know another state's intentions, right? And by the way, in the case of Taiwan, we know what their intentions are. Anyway, this gentleman, yeah, it would bring to your left. There's a.
The logic of your assumptions and following through is really appealing. The attempted parallel approach for failed hegemony, because even though the intentions of a state are not unitary, they're politically mixed up and diverse, there are any number of examples of local hegemons that have overplayed their hand and destroyed their position, and that should be part of the logic of, indeed, any rational or temporarily rational actors. How do I avoid becoming great in Britain and expending my wealth and losing everything? How do I avoid becoming Germany, and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. This is a great question. Just to unpack this just a bit, my argument is that as you grow more powerful economically, what you should do is turn that economic might into military might and try to dominate your region of the world. The counter-argument that my realist friends make, and these are my realist friends, the counter-argument that they make against me is, John, look at what happened to all the countries that tried to follow your theory. Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, they all ended up on the scrap heap of history. And John, there's only one country that pulled it off, and that's the United States of America. And we were in a very special situation because there were no other great powers physically located in this region of the world. So we kind of had a free hand, especially as immigration kicked in and the country got bigger and bigger. So if we follow your theory, John, we're going to end up getting destroyed. Therefore, if you're rational, right, and I do have a rational actor assumption, you will not do what John says, which is maximize your relative power. You'll expand ever so gently, but not push too far at all, okay? That's the counter-argument to me. My counter-argument is that there is no question that in the case of China and all these other cases, that they will meet resistance, right? They will meet resistance. But what happens is that states look for opportunities to overcome that resistance. They just don't sit there. They push and they push and they push. And they invariably get away with it for quite a while, especially as you get really powerful. And then usually what has happened in the past is they tripped and they didn't achieve regional hegemony, leaving the United States as the only example in modern history of a state achieving that vaunted goal. But I think what will happen in the Chinese case is they will try. And I think they will try because the logic that I laid out is so powerful. That's a self-serving statement, but I'm just telling you how I think about it. And if they're smart, if they're rational, going back to the rational actor assumption, they'll only push so far and then they'll stop because they understand that Uncle Sugar and his Asian allies are so powerful that they can't push any further. So my great hope is that we will contain them and there will be no war because the Chinese will recognize the logic that you're laying out. But at the same time, I do want to emphasize, I think the Chinese will constantly be probing. They'll be looking for opportunities. And the problem is that sometimes you end up getting a war in those situations. There's also, okay. No, if you just let the person back there, then we can come up here. Sorry.
Thank you. It seems like most of the examples that you've given...
Could you talk into the microphone?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I can't tell.
And
how
a little
loud I
louder?
am. It seems like most of the examples that you've given hinge on revisionist powers seeking some form of territorial expansion, that is like China taking over Taiwan, the way that America engaged in several wars during the 19th century over neighboring territories. I'm wondering if you could, but the problem with territorial expansion is that that kind of expansion is often very likely to provoke some kind of armed conflict. I'm wondering if you could speak to the potential of economic expansion provoking similar levels of armed conflict. That is, you look at the way that China has done a huge amount of investment in sub-Saharan Africa and in various natural resource-rich countries there. And in an age of capital flows being able to move across countries and national borders very easily, it's much, much easier to invest a huge amount of money in a country than it is to send a lot of troops there to take it over politically.
Yeah. Let me make a whole slew of different points just in response to that excellent question. First of all, remember I said the United States started out as 13 measly colonies, and then it had to conquer all this territory. China is already a giant landmass, so it doesn't have to go out and, conquer the equivalent of North America. It is a big country geographically already. Second point I'd make to you is they do have a handful of territorial disputes where they are pretty bullshit on the fact that they plan to settle those territorial disputes on their own terms. Third point I'd make is getting back to my response to this gentleman. I think that they would much prefer not to do that with a war. And I think they understand that from their point of view, the smart strategy is to grow economically and militarily and just become so powerful that you just dictate the terms of a settlement. If in the year 2050 China has turned into a giant Hong Kong, it is really rich. And it's got all those people, and it translates that economic might into a lot of military might. If they decide that they own the South China Sea, there's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing. This is Taiwan's problem, right? So in a very important way, they do have an interest in growing economically and avoiding war. This is the point that I was making to this gentleman. I was actually just repeating his or embellishing his point. They have a vested interest in not fighting a war. That's just the best way to do it, right? And they don't need much more territory. They do have these territorial disputes. There are 5 of them, by the way. They have a border dispute with India. They have a border dispute with Bhutan, not very significant. Taiwan. Those rocks in the East China Sea, the Senkaku and Diao Islands. And 5 is the South China Sea, right, which involves water and a handful of islands as well. Those are the 5 territorial disputes. Not a lot of territory in dispute there. And again, from their point of view, the best way to do it is economically. Just make one more point on this. I said before, I think that China's neighbors have precipitated almost all the crises that China has been involved in recent years. But I do think the Chinese have overreacted. I've said that to them when I go over there. I think they overplay their hand and they end up scaring everybody. It's just much smarter just to sit back and continue to grow economically. And at some point, you just become so powerful that there's nothing anybody can do. You don't have to be a Marxist to understand that economic might is the basis of military might. Yes, this woman here, and then I'll come to you next. Okay.
I just wondered that in one of your assumptions, which is that countries are anarchic, where do the multilaterals and the UN fit into that? It doesn't sound like you take them seriously at all.
That's a little too strong, but not by much. The UN is not very powerful. International institutions are just not very powerful. International law is not very powerful. Just think about the United Nations. You know, at the heart of the United Nations is the Security Council. And the Security Council basically is an institution within an institution where the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese all have a veto. So in a tough situation, if the Chinese aren't happy with what the UN's going to do, they just veto whatever's on the table, and we just veto what's on the table. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, the UN just has no real power. And then furthermore, what kind of military power does the UN have? There's not an independent UN army. It's comprised of the member states. And the member states that really have power are the United States, the Chinese, and the Russians. So this institution, this thing called the UN, just doesn't have much power. It can't push great powers around. And you remember when we went to war against Yugoslavia or Serbia in 1999? We didn't get a UN resolution. We broke the law. You're not allowed to go to war without a UN resolution. We went to war. We broke the law. So what? Who did anything? You remember when we invaded Iraq in 2003? You know that war was illegal? You think we cared? We didn't care. This is why when I hear Barack Obama and Samantha Power and all these people complaining about the Russians violating international law, you just sort of say to yourself, do these people ever look in the mirror? Come on. You know, John Kerry had that famous statement, don't the Russians understand this is the 21st century and you never invade another country without a UN resolution? Say, do you remember Iraq, John? You voted for it? Anyway, it's regrettable that we live in a world where international law doesn't matter for very much and these institutions don't have much power, but that's just the way it is. And by the way, you know who writes the rules? We write the rules. Often we don't sign the treaty, that's correct. Yeah, as I often say, we write the rules, and if we like them, we obey them, and if we don't like them, we either disobey them or rewrite the rules. That's the way it works. This gentleman has been very patient. Yes, I keep ignoring him. He probably has a zinger question. I'm going to put the pressure on you.
Really putting me on the spot. All right, John, I know something about you because I attended the Ukrainian panel this afternoon, went right home, and looked you up on Wikipedia.
I don't know what they're saying about me these days on Wikipedia.
Well, one thing I guessed the first time we started to speak this afternoon is that you and I are obviously both from Brooklyn because of our accents. Okay, but that's not, it doesn't have anything to do with my question. My question is, I discovered that you've written extensively about other hot spots in the world, in particular the Palestine-Israeli conflict. So my question is, of all the hot spots in the world, which is the most dangerous to world peace? Which could trigger the Third World War?
Yeah. Okay. Israel-Palestine, not dangerous for precipitating a major war. There's no Arab state that would pick a fight with Israel. Israel is Godzilla, right, is the most powerful conventional forces in the region by far. It's the only state with nuclear weapons. It's joined at the hip with the United States, right? Nobody's going to pick a fight with them. The Palestinians may start another intifada. I doubt that. I'm not 100% certain. I doubt that. But an intifada is not a war. And the United States and no other great power is going to get dragged into that conflict. So I don't view Israel-Palestine as a hot spot the way I do lots of other places. I think Ukraine-Russia is not much of a hot spot, right? I think there's no way we're getting involved, right? I think it's unlikely the Russians will go into eastern Ukraine, if they do go into eastern Ukraine, the war will be confined to Ukraine versus Russia, and the Russians will have, in effect, jumped into a briar patch, because conquest is so hard these days. But so I don't view Russia-Ukraine as that big a hotspot. The hotspots are in Asia, right? It's the Senkaku and Diao Islands, right? Very dangerous there. Is it likely that we'll have a war? No. Is it possible? Can you tell plausible stories? Yes. South China Sea makes me nervous. Korean Peninsula makes me nervous. So Asia is the key. And let me just say another word about this and link your question and my answer so far to the rise of China. If you go back to the Cold War, one of the reasons that we never had a hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union is because the conflict centered on the middle of Europe, what we used to call the Central Front. And in the center of Europe, you had two giant military machines armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, staring at each other eyeball to eyeball across the inter-German border. There was no way when we used to run war games that we could get a war started in Europe. You know that we couldn't get a war started in Europe when we ran war games because it would be World War III with nuclear weapons, right? And we would all get vaporized. Remember, I told you the fourth assumption, survival? Survival is a very powerful assumption. Remember Hobbes' state of nature, the importance of survival, right? So it was just unthinkable that the United States and the Soviet could fight this war. So we went to great lengths to avoid it. The situation in Asia is fundamentally different because of geography. There is no central front. And when you talk about fighting wars out in the middle of the East China Sea over a bunch of rocks, it's much easier to see how a war can get started. Or where you're talking about North Korea and South Korea getting into a fight on the Korean Peninsula and the Americans and the Chinese coming in. And for you young people who are not old enough to remember this, you want to remember that the Korean War started in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. By the winter of 1950-51, the South Koreans and the North Koreans were not the two principal fighting machines. It was the Americans and the Chinese. We fought China from 1950, late 1950, until the war ended in 1953. So the Americans and the Chinese did get sucked into the Korean War. So you can, again, hypothesize not likely but plausible scenarios where war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula and the Chinese and the Americans get pulled in, right? And again, the nuclear dimension, the threat of World War III with nuclear weapons just isn't there. Taiwan's another case. It's easy to imagine wars between China and the United States involving Taiwan. So my argument is that the likelihood of war between the United States and China in the story that I just told you is not great. I don't want to overstate the case. The security competition will be intense, as it was in the Cold War. The likelihood of war is not great. But nevertheless, I think it's much greater than it was during the Cold War, and therefore a real cause of concern. So I think Asia is the place where we have to be really careful. Not so much Europe, and with regard to Israel-Palestine, I don't think that's a big problem at all, for the question that you asked. I'll take this gentleman, and then I'll take the person in front of him.
You said earlier that the best situation with respect to China's growth rate is that it slows down or flatlines.
Yes.
You know, we see, just in terms of Wall Street, China's growth rate falls from 7.5 to 7.4, yes. And Wall Street goes down 300 points. And there goes your 401k. So I'm not quite sure that the average American would necessarily agree with you on that point.
Yeah. The average American would not agree with me. And most people inside Washington would not agree with me. But that doesn't mean they're wrong. They're right. Right. I opposed the Iraq War. Most people I knew favored the Iraq War. I was right, they were wrong. Am I always right? No. I want to be very clear. As I told you, my theory is fallible. I'm wrong at least 25% of the time. If you ask my kids, more like 95% of the time, right? But I'm not infallible. But I would just say, sometimes the conventional wisdom is wrong. And I think on this one, the conventional wisdom is wrong. And I think, just to go back to Taiwan, which is my favorite example, I think more and more people in Taiwan are coming to realize that they were foolish to think that the rise of China was a good thing. Right? If you lived in a world where there were no security threats, war was not a possibility, it was a world of pure economic interdependence, and that was all that mattered, then the rise of China would have been wonderful for Taiwan. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. Right. So I think you're correct that most people would disagree with what I have to say. By the way, I often go to audiences and I say, you know, what you want to do is go home and think about this question. You have two choices. The Chinese economy flatlines or the Chinese economy goes up at a steep rate for the next 30 years. Which would you choose? And I always say that I think most people would choose what you said they would choose. Well, that's one advantage of being old, right? Right, that's right. Yeah, we probably won't be around to see whether I'm right or wrong. This gentleman here.
Okay, you talked about the likelihood of a hot war in Asia being greater than that during the Cold War. Right? So what do you consider the most likely intensity of destructive conflict in East Asia, and how destructive will that be, especially for East Asian states?
Yeah, his question was which one of those conflict scenarios that I described that I think would be the worst, and how bad would it get? This is a really good question. The truth is that because of nuclear weapons, I think the war cannot purposely spin out of control, right? In other words, if a war starts between China and Japan and the United States comes in, all three players have a profound interest in preventing it from escalating because, again, we're dealing with nuclear weapons. So you cannot fight, in my opinion, World War III in Europe, in Asia, for the same reasons you couldn't do it in Europe. But what I'm saying you can do in Asia that you could not do in Europe is you can fight limited wars. But they have to stay limited, okay? And assuming control of the escalation process, they will remain limited. The fly in the ointment is inadvertent escalation, right? My friend Barry Posen, who teaches at MIT, brilliant guy, wrote a book at the end of the Cold War that nobody read because the Cold War ended. But the title of Posen's book is Inadvertent Escalation. And what he did in the book was he talked about how a conventional war in Europe could escalate to a nuclear war. Because what you see is that those conventional and nuclear forces are kind of all bound up and inextricably linked with each other in funny kinds of ways, so that if you fight a conventional war, a limited conventional war, it can spin out of control in unanticipated ways, and you end up with a nuclear war, right? Sort of World War III with nuclear weapons. Now, my argument is there will be powerful incentives to prevent that from happening, but who can know for sure? Sir? Pardon? Oh, okay, we'll come up there. You and I, you're handling one set of questions, I'm handling, okay.
Partly, perhaps you've answered, being that nationalism is such a powerful force and perhaps irrational, wouldn't that kind of tip things, that inevitable...
make war more likely.
Make war more likely.
Yeah,
and then the other thought was, why did the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear stockpile?
Yeah. I'll take them in reverse order. As I said this afternoon at the talk on Ukraine, I wrote a piece in 1993 that's set in Foreign Affairs that said Ukraine should not give up its nuclear weapons. I don't know how many of you know this, but when the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine ended up with thousands of nuclear warheads. It had the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. And as I said this afternoon, we gave the Ukrainians compound fractures of all 4 limbs to force them to give up their nuclear weapons, which they did. They gave their nuclear weapons back to Russia. And I said at the time that that was a huge mistake. I think they did it because they got independence like that, hadn't thought about this issue, and the United States was so powerful and so influential at that point in time that we were able to coerce them. We also, as somebody mentioned today, gave them a quasi-guarantee that we would protect them and so forth and so on. So they gave up their weapons. And I think if they had had nuclear weapons, you would not have even had the crisis, right? The Americans would have gone to great lengths to make sure there was no coup in Ukraine, because the idea of a coup in a nuclear-armed state scares the living bejesus out of us. This is the Pakistan scenario. You know, we do not want to see the government overthrown in Pakistan when that is all those nuclear weapons floating around. So I think if Ukraine had a couple thousand nuclear weapons, we would not have been fostering a coup. But they gave them up. Your other question has to do with nationalism. Let me just say a few words about nationalism. There's a whole literature on this that's worth looking at. Just to focus mainly on the Chinese case. The problem that the Chinese government faces is that communism, which has been the dominant ideology since 1949, just no longer has much legitimacy, right? I mean, the Chinese can say they're communists, but nobody takes it that seriously. It's funny, whenever I go to China and you talk to people about Marxism, nobody takes it seriously. It's like a joke. So they have a legitimacy problem, and that legitimacy problem, of course, is also caused by the fact that it's not a democracy, right? So they rely on nationalism. The elites rely on nationalism, because nationalism is the glue. It holds people together. And if you read literature on Chinese nationalism today, the centerpiece of Chinese nationalism is the century of national humiliation. And that is a huge source of trouble, because who were the humiliators? The Japanese, the Americans. So you get a crisis over the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands, and that's a crisis with Japan and the United States, and you have a regime that does not have a lot of legitimacy and has to worry about being seen as weak, because there's a lot of nationalism down bottom in Chinese society, right? So the regime has to be tough with Japan and the United States, given the century of national humiliation. And therefore, it doesn't have much maneuver room. It's going to be remarkably difficult for who's ever in charge of Beijing to back down, right? And of course, in Japan, you have a similar situation, because nationalism is alive and well over there. I'm not going to talk about that, but Japan's becoming increasingly nationalistic. So you get the Japanese and the Chinese, you know, in a crisis, and they have little maneuver room to back down. Really significant potential for trouble. And this is why I think I was saying a few minutes ago when I was in Beijing in November, I talked to a number of scholars, and these are people who normally are more optimistic than me, right? When I go to Beijing and talk to scholars, most scholars think I'm too pessimistic. John, there's this factor, that factor, economic interdependence, Confucian culture, But when I was there in November, people were much more pessimistic than me because of the nationalism angle and the fact that they felt it would box the Chinese leadership in a crisis because of the legitimacy issue. Okay.
I'd like to sharpen the question that my neighbor here asked about Chinese resource exploitation relationships, and also getting to the topic of the talk, can Chinese rice peacefully, can China rise peacefully, part of the rise of China is securing resources, energy resources and relationships in the Middle East and in Africa. Another portion is in securing food resources in our hemisphere. So could you say what your thoughts are on can China continue to do, or how can it continue to do both of those, which seem to be very important to me. Your emphasis on the size of China, they have serious environmental issues, climate change and other things, droughts. They're not buying soybeans heavily in South America because it's just cheap. So can China continue to grow in getting resources in our hemisphere? And can China oil continue to grow and develop? Or how will, that's the question. The question is.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's no question that to fuel the Chinese economy over time, they're going to have to go outside of China itself, outside of East Asia, to get resources. Almost all of the studies show that they are now heavily dependent on oil from the Persian Gulf, and that over time it's going to go up significantly. They're going to be more dependent on oil from the Gulf, not less. And as you were saying, they have all sorts of economic relations with countries in Africa, and increasingly so in South America as well, because they have a voracious appetite for these natural resources. And that's only going to increase with the passage of time. So I think there's no question about that. But what does that mean? It means that having the freedom to roam really matters to them. They're going to build the Blue Water Navy. They're already talking about building a Blue Water Navy. We have a Blue Water Navy. Why do we have a Blue Water Navy? Because we have interests all over the world, and we're interested in protecting our sea lanes of communication, or to put it in slightly different terms, we're interested in commanding the sea. The same thing is going to apply to them. They think all the time about the fact that their sea lines of communication from the Gulf back to East Asia are not very secure, and how can they get around that? Should they build pipelines and ports and railroad lines in Pakistan and Myanmar? I mean, they're constantly thinking about this, right? So I think what's going to happen with the passage of time as they grow more powerful is that the conflict, the competition, let's put it that way, security competition between the United States and China is going to spread globally, just as it did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Remember, just think about the etymology of the word superpower, right? William T.R. Fox is the man who invented this concept. And he said that a superpower was a great power that could project significant military might outside of its region of the world. And the United States and the Soviet Union were both superpowers because they could project power all over the planet. And that's why the competition, as you well remember, between the United States and the Soviet Union was global in nature. We even barked at each other over places like Angola and Africa, so forth and so on. China right now is not a superpower because it does not have the capability to project power outside of its region. It may have interests in Africa, it may have interests in the Gulf, but it does not have military might in those regions or the ability to project power into those regions. I think what will happen over time as they grow economically and translate that economic might into military might and build a Blue Water Navy, they will be able to compete with us around the planet. And God forbid they come into the Western Hemisphere. This is the whole Monroe Doctrine story. You were telling the story, I think quite correctly, about how they now have all these interests in South America. That's true, but we do not want them to have economic interests plus military capabilities in South America.